Well, thank you, thank you. As a person who was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to be able to be here to speak with Bree Newsome, who's been doing work in this community about symbols, history, and this legacy of white supremacy that people are still grappling with today. So why don't we get started? Can you just tell us more, Bree, about the work that you are doing in Charlotte and how people are responding to it, and sort of what are your big ticket items you're working with now?
Yeah, certainly. So I am a local community organizer here. One of the main issues that I'm trying to help organize around right now is the issue of housing justice, which is really, I would argue, at the intersection of so many other issues. So obviously policing has been at the forefront. You know, it was just mentioned how Charlotte has an issue, obviously, to put it lightly, of economic mobility, upward economic mobility. But one of the things that we know is that access to safe, stable, affordable housing is one of the most key ways that people are able to come out of poverty. It has been shown in other cities that if they're trying to end homelessness, you know, sometimes people think, well, if we can first get people a job, then maybe they can get money. But what studies have shown is that securing housing is really the first basic need. So, and I mean, our ability to live in safe neighborhoods is also connected to policing, and so many of these are schools as well. You know, what neighborhood you live in determines what school you go to. Where I live over in West Charlotte, you know, if you were to look at a school over there and then compare it to a public school in South Charlotte, you might not think that they were in the same school system. So
it seems like you're in the center of this tangled knot of different things you're trying to pull apart. Where do they join? What makes housing related to policing, and how did you see that play out over the last year?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the basic issue, again, it comes down to racism and economic justice. And even those two issues you can't really untangle, because economic inequality, as people of color know, is directly tied to racism. Racism impacts our ability to get home loans. Racism impacts our interactions with police in our community. So there really is no separation. When the uprising happened last year, that was a straw breaking the camel's back moment. It was in direct response to the killing of Keith Lamont Scott, but it's really in response to a condition, and that's true of any of the uprisings that we've seen, whether it's in Ferguson or in Baltimore. This is coming after, you know, a series of police killings here. We had the Jonathan Farrell case. We had Letitia Fonville, who was killed in her home. We had Larico Williams, who was tasered to death when he was unarmed. On top of the squeeze around housing, not being able to have access to affordable housing, the cost of housing going up while wages are stagnant, all of these things contribute to a condition, and eventually the community that has, you know, protested and petitioned for so long reaches a breaking point.
So why Charlotte? Why do you think the uprising happened here, protests here, when I think the other places where they happen, Baltimore, you look at St. Louis, they've traditionally been seen as places that have always struggled with race and racism. But Charlotte doesn't really have that reputation historically. So what is the underlying thing about Charlotte? Well, number one, why are we here talking about Charlotte?
Yeah, well, I think the key thing in what you just said was reputation and seen as, right? So how the reputation and how something is perceived is not necessarily the same as reality. I have visited both St. Louis and Baltimore. I think one of the differences there is that some of the conditions are more in your face, particularly in Baltimore. You know, if you were to walk from where Freddie Gray was killed to the Inner Harbor, it's not that far. I went up there and marched during the protests there. And so it's really in your face. In Charlotte, we're a little bit more geographically spread out, and it's possible to be in Charlotte. You can live in one area of Charlotte and be completely oblivious to the other part, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I mean, we absolutely have our own history of segregation. We absolutely have our own history of urban renewal. You know, we had prosperous Black neighborhoods like Brooklyn that were pretty much wiped out. During the uprising, there were several different points where protesters marched up 277 and blocked the street. And that wasn't just to stop traffic, that's also in protest of roadways that were literally run through Black neighborhoods and pretty much destroyed them. So yes, and I mean, I think that's true not just of Charlotte, but of North Carolina. There's kind of this perception that, you know, we are the more progressive, you know, part of the South. We are the new South, right? I think there's some truth to that. We have a lot of diversity. We have a lot of people who are relocating here and refining our identity in some ways. But the Old South is still very much there. The New South is something that we have to define what that looks like, but we don't get there without confronting the truth of our past.
So why now, do you think? Why the past 2 years are we seeing sort of the facade of the New South, especially in what might be its capital, Charlotte? It's crumbling a bit, and there seems to be a long arc of history between what you're mentioning, the placement of highways through communities, the segregation, the other reverse segregation and white flight. Those seem to have all come to a head this year and last year. What do you think is the animating spirit there?
I think there's a combination of factors that are going on. So I think economically, we are not separate from the rest of the nation. We had a major housing crash in 2009. And though there are certain sectors and certain segments of the population that bounce back from that, the reality is that African Americans lost about 3/4 of our wealth in that collapse. So, and we haven't really recovered from that. So I think you have a confluence of conditions going on in the mix with the election of the nation's first Black president, which happened in 2008. North Carolina voted for a Democratic president for the first time since the Civil Rights Movement. That was a major seismic shift, and it was around that time, around 2013, that I first really got involved in activism, and one of the first things I was protesting over was the attack on voting rights in our state. So what we have seen is some kind of like steady progress that has happened since the Civil Rights Movement, and also backlash. Both of those things have been going on. It hasn't only moved in one direction. So just as CMS was being credited in a lot of ways for its busing program and really achieving equality, there was also counteraction to that. It was never just moving in one direction.
Yeah, that counteraction. I think another part of that Charlotte being the New South thing is, as a kid, I never saw the Confederate flag or those type of symbols in polite spaces, right? But you notice now with counter-protesters, you see, I think, a lot more of the flag. You see people sort of, the alt-right creeping in, even in Charlotte. What do you think the role is of these symbols in sort of promoting maybe a little bit of that backlash against Obama? Where do they come from and why?
Well, I think it has the same meaning today that it did in 1960, right? So the Confederate flag is not something that was prevalent throughout the South immediately following the Civil War. It's something that came back into popular usage, and you can trace the popularity of kind of like the ebb and flow around the popularity of Confederate symbols corresponds to the ebb and flow of civil rights movement. So a lot of the Confederate monuments that people are protesting now were first erected like in the 1920s, when lynching was at its peak. A lot of the Confederate flags that were raised, including the one in South Carolina that I removed, was raised in like 1961. They were raised in the 60s as statements of opposition to the civil rights movement. And the resurgence in popularity today is also in response to modern civil rights and Black liberation movements. I mean, there was not, I promise you, when we removed the Confederate flag, you saw Confederate flags in places that you hadn't seen them before they started appearing, all over the place. And they mean the same thing today that they did back then. Back then it was, we don't support Martin Luther King, we don't support civil rights. Today it's, we don't support Black Lives Matter, we don't support Colin Kaepernick, we don't support racial equality. Same difference.
So it's been 2 years since you took the flag down? 2 years.
Yeah.
What's your life been like for the past 2 years? As a person who now is known for protesting that flag, do you feel compelled to speak out about its prominence, its resurgence, and just the role of symbols now? Yes
and no. So I think to a certain extent, yes. I think it's pretty known how I feel about Confederate symbology, particularly on public property and on state property, as it was the case in South Carolina. The main thing that's changed for me is I've just been given more of a platform. A movement to remove Confederate symbology was never a focus for me before the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, at which point I felt it was important to make that statement. But I think that the ongoing movements to remove Confederate flags and monuments and everything like that, it's mostly local. local movements, which is kind of how I feel it should be. I mean, in Charlottesville, I know a lot of the organizers there. They worked for a long time. They lobbied, they organized their community members, and they eventually got the city to agree to remove the Confederate monument. Of course, then they became a national target. But I think for the most part, that's kind of how it should go. I'm not necessarily trying to parachute in everywhere and remove symbols. Though I sometimes still get people contacting me, they're like, Bree, I just saw a Confederate flag on the highway. What should I do? And I'm like, well, you might want to consult a lawyer first before you do anything. I did that. I recommend doing that. But even beyond that, so I think symbols, monuments, these are very important. They represent an ideology, right? But we could remove all the Confederate monuments. That doesn't mean that we can then pat ourselves on the back and be like, okay, slavery's over, racism's over, we've solved everything because we removed the monuments. So as much as I argue for removing them, I'm constantly pushing people beyond that. That's just the start. We have to address policy. We have to address social practice. It's not enough to just take down a monument.
Yeah, it seems like post-Charlottesville, especially, the conversation has been symbols, 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 flags, statues, Confederate memorials. Do you think now, I mean, even among good sort of people who you are working with, well-meaning folks, their stance one way or the other on the flag might be obscuring sort of the actual ongoing work underneath that?
To a certain extent. Like, I don't think there is a day in America where we have achieved racial justice and equality and we have monuments to Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis up around the nation. So I think that's a necessary step in things coming down. But like I said, we have to constantly push for the deeper work to be done. What happened in the past years, which is great, is that we went from a point where there was a refusal to even lower the Confederate flag in South Carolina to half-staff as they were burying an assassinated black representative, right, who was just killed by a white supremacist in a historically black church. We've gone from there to, the governor of Louisiana quickly taking down statues. So that shows a change, a shifting in the thinking of the mainstream. And so it's great that people are now, many municipalities across the country are embracing this idea of removing the Confederate symbology. However, right, where we have to be careful is it can be very easy to be like, oh, again, our city, we've had this big ceremony, we've removed the monument, and now we can keep going. And my question is like, no, now we need to talk about why are black people in your city disproportionately poor? Why are the black children in your city disproportionately at underperforming schools? Those are the deeper conversations that we have to have. And that's the way it is with all movement. Like, it's great, you reach a certain point where certain things that you're pushing for kind of move into the mainstream, that's great. But as an activist, we have to keep pushing.
But what's it say to you when so many of these movements to get rid of flags, to think about and challenge people's understanding of symbols, that's met with so much resistance and violence in some cases? What does that say for doing the sort of more difficult work when that very surface symbolic thing is so difficult?
Well, I think that speaks to how deep it is, right? That's how deeply ingrained it is that and that was one of my frustrations even in 2015. Here we had an instance where this young white man from Columbia, South Carolina, the capital of South Carolina, went down to Charleston, shot several black people in a historically black church. And the focus in the following days was not, let's pause and examine what are all the conditions that led to this situation. The focus was on the Confederate flag and why we can't lower the Confederate flag even to half-staff because of these laws that have been passed, right? So the fact that the monuments, the Confederate monuments still get more weight and importance and energy than Black lives. In Charlottesville, I mean, even with Heather Heyer, who was, a young white woman who was killed there, there's still more focus on the Robert E. Lee statue than on her life or examining the person who ran her over. We're still more focused on pieces of metal and pieces of fabric than human life. That's what we should be talking about.
So when we started planning this, I think what was on our minds was Keith Lamont Scott. Mm-hmm. What was the uprising, was the protest and the disturbances and the police response over the past year. But now we have Ruben Galindo. Why has there not been sort of the same outrage from your perspective of what people in Charlotte are going through? Is there a fatigue or people just sort of thinking of different ways? What's going on there?
I don't know. I don't know that you can't say that there's not the same level of outrage. I think that the tensions in every city and within this nation kind of ebb and flow. I mean, just in St. Louis, I mean, they had just had another uprising of sorts. It's not on the same level that that Ferguson was in 2014. But it hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped the protest. I think, again, some other conditions that I think are important to keep in mind around the time of Keith Lamont Scott. We also had, and forgive me, I can't call the name. I think Philando Castile had just happened around that time, and oh goodness, the black man who was shot getting out of his car, had his hands up, was shot by a white female police officer. And I'm sorry, I can't call his name right now. But those cases had just happened as well. So there was already a tension that had been building when Keith Lamont Scott happened. So I don't think that people are less outraged. I think that there are just certain moments and kind of a combination of factors that can trigger that kind of response. Because an uprising is not a planned protest. This is not where people get together and say, okay, we're going to march in the streets. This is an immediate emotional response that a community is showing at having reached a breaking point.
I'm going to open up the floor for questions in 1 minute, so everybody get your questions together. But a follow-up to that question, it does seem, when you have continued sort of police shootings, when you have these concerns that people don't feel are adequately addressed by the people in power, is there no sort of sense of, okay, maybe this might be, maybe there's fatigue, maybe people are, they think that nothing's going to come of something. So how do people sort of motivate themselves to do the work of racial justice?
There's possibly some of that. I think as an organizer, I think uprisings happen when there's less organization, right? So we reach a point of an uprising when we are not organized to the point of one, preventing it from happening in the first place, and two, from having an organized response when it happens. Part of what we have seen with the Ruben Galindo cases, there's been an organized response. So there, we haven't at least yet reached another point of having an uprising. But a lot of times what happens is that the cameras particularly don't show up. Like cameras tend to not show up unless there's violence, unless there's disruption, unless there's a window broken. Right? They don't even show up when somebody dies, but they'll show up if the window is broken and they can flash the camera on it. But when we are organized, it doesn't look like that. Being organized doesn't look like we have to go uptown and smash a window in order for folks to show up and we get a response. Being organized looks like we have a petition already signed, we have a response all ready to go, we're showing up at city council, we're demanding these things, we're challenging laws that were put in place following Keith Lamont Scott, where now we have to go through court to request video. Part of why we have the video of Ruben Galindo is because organizations work together to press the court on getting that video released, since there was a law that had been passed since Keith Lamont Scott requiring us to go to court in order to get access to body camera footage.
Yeah, that's what I was going to note is the reason why we know so much about it is sort of the things put in place over the past year, the laws, the rules of accountability for police.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, let's open up for questions. Come on, somebody has a good question. Just a diaphragm. Yeah, I can hear you.
Mm-hmm. So how do we address, from a grassroots perspective, getting people trained into the workforce and compete?
Yes, well, again, I think it's a both and, because the issue isn't simply that people need training or that people need access to jobs. The part of the issue is that we are confronting a system that doesn't provide jobs for people. That system is rooted in slavery, which was about free labor. And I think you're completely right. I mean, part of the issue that we have been dealing with since emancipation is the resistance to a free, empowered, economically and politically empowered Black population. I mean, that's what the basic pushback is. So we have people who they have jobs in prison that they can't get on the outside. They get trained on things that they can do in prison that they don't get access to those jobs outside. So it has to be a both and. On one, and you were asking practically and tactically. That's one of the things that we try to do is to have community skill sharing. There's a lot of organizing and building that we have to do outside of existing institutions because institutionally things are set up to maintain a racial caste. So, you know, having skills training, job training, and at the same time pushing against the system that's not hiring people, whether they are trained or not. Even if you can get a job and you're not being paid enough, you're not being paid a living wage, so you still can't afford to live in the city, doesn't do us any good. So we have to push for both of those things at the same time. And I would argue that economic justice is racial justice. I don't think you can separate those two things.
All right.
Brilliant discussion. I wanted to ask you, in the world of activism, there is a supposed tension between millennial activists and older activists. What are some things you think each generation can teach each other, and what do you think is a path forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some truth to that, and to a certain extent, I feel like it's a little overblown sometimes, because I think that has existed forever. I don't think that's just something that's between millennials and you know, older generations. I think that's something that people who are involved with SNCC, you know, they would sometimes bump heads with people from SCLC. So I don't think that's anything new. I think that young people are more eager a lot of times, sometimes more optimistic, sometimes, you know, more aggressive in terms of pushing for change. I think one of the things that has happened with this more modern movement is it has mostly been young people being killed by police. So in this confrontation against police brutality in particular, and like when I first got involved in movement work in 2013, that was one of the major issues, was that young people were wanting to push this issue of police brutality to the forefront. And some of the like older folks within the movement didn't want to go there. They wanted to talk about some other things. And we were like, you really can't look away. In terms of what we can learn from each other, I think there's a lot to be learned from what has already happened in the past. There are a lot of things we think we might be doing that are new. It's not new at all. I think really understanding a lot of the strategy that went into some of the tactics that were employed in the past, like for instance, we might do a sit-in, you know, and be modeling, you know, a sit-in from the 60s, but you know, I think it's important to understand the strategy that went into doing that. But I also think it's important to listen to young people. There are some things that young people are dealing with now that are new. The school to prison pipeline. You know, young people being forced out of school systematically and into prisons, this interaction with the police. I mean, that's something that has always existed, but I think it is on another level now. I think that cameras have just kind of brought it to the forefront, the amount of young people who are, you know, losing their lives to the criminal justice system one way or the other. I think that covers Trayvon Martin. I think that covers Khalif Browder, Jonathan Farrell. I think it covers with all of them. One way or the other, they are being killed by this system.
Well, I want to say thank you for your questions, and yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.